Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a pretty sizable 7-game slate here for college basketball. Now, this slate is not super ideal. There's not a ton of value plays available in this slate, uh, or just the pricing is a little bit tighter on the slate in general. I felt like the good players are a little bit overpriced, and then like even the cheaper guys are a little overpriced for the slate. Also, the games, several games are going to be pretty, risky when it comes to blowout potentials, with probably at least a few of the games being in that situation. So let's go ahead and get into my picks for each game. I've got North Carolina State over Louisville. I've got Western Kentucky over South Carolina, Kansas over Harvard, Creighton over Butler, Washington State over George Washington, and then Illinois over Missouri. With two of those games, North Carolina State and Louisville, and Kansas and Harvard, looking like blowout potential. You could even look at Washington State and George Washington being a bit of a blowout game as well. So, but Kansas obviously over Harvard is the big one. So you're gonna have to take that into consideration when you're building lineups, because some of those guys from those teams might be a little bit risky when it comes to playing deep in the game. So let's go ahead and get into the players I do like today, though. So we're going to start with my top overall pick, Tequavion Smith here. Sorry for butchering your name, for North Carolina State. He's been averaging 1.02 fantasy points per minute, which is one of the better on the board at guard. And he is $9,000. He's been solid every single game this season. He's been playing really well. You can see he's got 30 fantasy points in almost every game, with the exception of one, I think. So overall, that's just a really solid situation for him to be in. I really like him in this matchup against Louisville, who's just not very good in general. And so I expect him to play well and play hard and get a really good fantasy game here overall. Then we're going to look at, see here, Grady Dick for Kansas. Now, he's a little bit risky because of the blowout potential here, but his minutes have been solid, and he's had 4 straight games over 28 fantasy points. I look for that to continue here. As you can see, even in the last 4 games, 3 of those were kind of blowouts, and so I expect him to continue this onslaught of scoring that he's been doing. The only real thing with him is that he's not a big he does get a couple of steals and stuff in most games, but he really hasn't been a gigantic stat stuffer when it comes to other statistics. So do keep that in mind, that he's a little bit scoring dependent, but he's still playing well, and so he's viable on the slate. He's also averaging 0.92 fantasy points per game. Then we're going to look at Kevin McCullough Jr. for Kansas, also looking really solid today. He's been playing well all season long. He's only got 1 game under 20 fantasy points this season, and his price point here is pretty reasonable. He is averaging 1.03 fantasy points per game at $7,400. He and Grady Dick both look like decent plays on the slate. So take your pick on those guys. I would probably only roster one of these guys if you do end up rostering them, simply because of the pricing and because of the risk of blowout and stuff like that. So whichever guy you like more, I would go with. But overall, he's been really solid, so I think he's a viable option on the slate. Then we're going to look at Ellis for Louisville. Now, I don't really love Louisville that much today, but he's been playing really well, and he's been playing a massive amount of minutes the last few games. As you can see, he's playing nearly 35 minutes a game, almost 40 in a couple of these games, and perhaps 40 in the last game. In the last 3 games, when they in 2 of the last 3 games that they won, he played extremely well, got a lot of assists, got some points, stuff like that. So he definitely has some potential here. He's starting to find himself a little bit. He's hitting some threes, playing pretty well. He's played pretty decently for most of the season, but he's really starting to pick up, and so I think he's in a good spot here to be a viable option. And then finally for the guards, we're going to look at Jay Mullins for Washington State. Now this game, they have one of the higher scoring, they're one of the higher scoring teams on the slate, and that gives him some viability here at a pretty limited price comparatively. Though he is averaging only 6.69 fantasy points per minute. He's had some bad games, but he's had some really good ones, and he is just back from injury. The last game was his first game back, and he had 16 points. He is pretty scoring dependent, though, so do keep that in mind. But he does have some opportunity here in this game on a high scoring team to play well and get a pretty good stat line. And with such limited amounts of value options on the slate, he's going to be somebody you definitely want to take a look at as a decent option. So then we're going to look at the forward situation here. We're going to start with Jalen Wilson for Kansas. Just like I said about the other Kansas players, he's a little bit risky because of the blowout potential, but he's been playing really well. His price point is obviously high, but he has big time scoring potential. He's only had, I think, one game under 25 fantasy points, if not, or maybe one game, under, 2 games under 25. So I expect him to play well in this matchup. He's been dominating. He's had some really monster games. He's been getting double-doubles, and that's always a viable thing in slates like this. Then we'll look at G.G. Jackson here for the South Carolina Gamecocks. He's been playing pretty reasonably here. He has no games under 23 fantasy points this season, though this is one of the lower scoring games on the slate, so do keep that in mind. And he is averaging 0.87 fantasy points per game, but he is a viable option on the slate in general. Then we'll look at Coleman Hawkins from Illinois, who just looks like he's in a really good spot here. He's had 5 games over 24 fantasy points in a row, and he's averaging 30 plus minutes, and this is a nice matchup. I expect him to play well in this game. Obviously, his price point has come up quite a bit because of his recent play, but overall, he is viable on the slate. He is averaging 0.83 fantasy points per game on the season. And then we're going to look at Ricky Lindo Jr. for Golden State, George Washington. Now he is doing a lot of good things in these games. Only under 20 fantasy point game on the season. He's also averaging 1.04 fantasy points per game, which is really good, and so that makes him pretty viable on the slate, especially with his minutes being really good 3 of the last 4 games. So I really expect him to have a good game, and he's a little bit cheaper, so you can get him in the lineup a little bit easier. Then we'll look at Chris Lidlam for Harvard. Now, Harvard is obviously in a rough situation here against Kansas, but he does have some upside here. He's only had 2 games under 30 fantasy points on the season. This is a tough matchup, but he has been playing well in his games this season long. I really don't see why he doesn't get a full complement of minutes, take a lot of shot opportunities. He also does rebound decently, and you can also throw him in the guard or forward position. So obviously this is a little bit risky because of the matchup, but Harvard is still projected to score around 60 fantasy points, or 60 real points, and I expect that he's going to have to get a decent chunk of those. So I think, and he's averaging 1.21 fantasy points per game. He's obviously a pretty solid player for Harvard. And if we look at Harvard, he is pretty much their best player, fantasy points wise and just in general. So I expect him to play well in this game, especially because he has nothing to lose. Then we're going to look finally at DJ Rodman for Washington State. Now, DJ Rodman has been playing a lot of minutes lately. And 4 of the last 5 games, he's over 35 minutes. I expect that to continue here, and he's been playing really well. Now, he's not as big of a scoring guy, but he's been getting a lot of rebounds and stuff, and that's helping him. He's just a little bit cheap option at $5,900, which gives us some movement. Obviously, we need several guys that are cheap, and he's a pretty decent option. He really isn't a big scorer, but he has been managing to have decent fantasy point games, and quite frankly, it's kind of hard to find guys under that 6,000 range that are doing that, and so he was one of the better options that I could find. So with that said, guys, that's what I have here for college basketball today. Obviously, not as an ideal slate as we've had yesterday. We had some nice wins yesterday in college basketball, but on fantasy. But overall, I don't like the slate near as much, but it's still viable, and you can still make some lineups that work. Obviously, you're gonna have to find some value guys uh, in this slate if you're gonna pay up for anybody. But overall, you know it's a 7 game slate. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.